"The captain here has been telling me," Hermann began in a homely and amicable voice, and Falk gave a low, nervous laugh. His cool, negligent undertone had no inflections, but the strength of a powerful emotion made him ramble in his speech. He had always desired a home. It was difficult to live alone, though he was not answerable. He was domestic. There had been difficulties, but since he had seen Hermann's niece, he found that it had become at last impossible to live by himself. "I mean, impossible," he repeated with no sort of emphasis, and only with the slightest of pauses. But the word fell into my mind with the force of a new idea. "I have not said anything to her yet," Hermann observed quietly, and Falk dismissed this by a, "That's all right, certainly, very proper." There was a necessity for perfect frankness, in marrying especially. Hermann seemed attentive, but he seized the first opportunity to ask us into the cabin. "And by the by, Falk," he said innocently as we passed in, "the timber came to no less than $47.50. Falk, uncovering his head, lingered in the passage. "Some other time," he said, and Hermann nudged me angrily. I don't know why. The girl, alone in the cabin, sat sewing at some distance from the table. Falk stopped short in the doorway. Without a word, without a sign, without the slightest inclination of his bony head, by the silent intensity of his look alone, he seemed to lay his Herculean frame at her feet. Her hands sank slowly on her lap, and raising her clear eyes, she let her soft, beaming glance enfold him from head to foot, like a slow and pale caress. He was very hot when he sat down. She, with bowed head, went on with her sewing, but her neck was very white under the light of the lamp. But Falk, hiding his face in the palms of his hands, shuddered faintly. He drew them down, even to his beard, and his uncovered eyes astonished me by their tense and irrational expression, as though he had just swallowed a heavy gulp of alcohol. It passed away while he was binding us to secrecy. Not that he cared, but he did not like to be spoken about. And I looked at the girl's marvelous, at her wonderful, at her regal hair, plaited tight into that one astonishing and maidenly tress. Whenever she moved her well-shaped head, it would stir stiffly to and fro on her back. The thin cotton sleeve fitted the irreproachable roundness of her arm like a skin, and her very dress, stretched on her bust, seemed to palpitate like a living tissue with the strength of vitality animating her body. How good her complexion was, the outline of her soft cheek, and the small convoluted conch of her rosy ear. To pull her needle, she kept the little finger apart from the others. It seemed a waste of power to see her sewing, eternally sewing, with that industrious and precise movement of her arm, going on eternally upon all the oceans, under all the skies, in innumerable harbors. And suddenly I heard Falk's voice declare that he could not marry a woman unless she knew of something in his life that had happened 10 years ago. It was an accident, an unfortunate accident. It would affect the domestic arrangements of their home. But once told, it need not be alluded to again for the rest of their lives. "I should want my wife to feel for me," he said. "It has made me unhappy." And how could he keep the knowledge of it to himself, he asked us, perhaps through years and years of companionship? What sort of companionship would that be? He had thought it over. A wife must know. Then why not at once? He counted on Hermann's kindness for presenting the affair in the best possible light. And Hermann's countenance, mystified before, became very sour. He stole an inquisitive glance at me, I shook my head blankly. Some people thought, Falk went on, that such an experience changed a man for the rest of his life. He couldn't say. It was hard, awful, and not to be forgotten, but he did not think himself a worse man than before. Only he talked in his sleep now, he believed. At last I began to think he had accidentally killed someone, perhaps a friend, his own father, maybe, when he went on to say that probably we were aware he never touched meat. Throughout he spoke English, of course on my account. He swayed forward heavily. The girl, with her hands raised before her pale eyes, was threading her needle. He glanced at her, and his mighty trunk overshadowed the table, bringing nearer to us the breadth of his shoulders, the thickness of his neck, and that incongruous anchorite head, burnt in the desert, hollowed and lean as if by excesses of vigils and fasting. His beard flowed imposingly downwards, out of sight between the two brown hands gripping the edge of the table, and his persistent glance, made somber by the wide dilations of the pupils, fascinated. "Imagine to yourselves," he said in his ordinary voice, "that I have eaten man." I could only ejaculate a faint "ah" of complete enlightenment, but Hermann, dazed by the excessive shock, actually murmured, "Himmel, what for?" "It was my terrible misfortune to do so," said Falk in a measured undertone. The girl, unconscious, sewed on. Mrs. Hermann was about in one of the staterooms, sitting up with Lena, who was feverish, but Hermann suddenly put both his hands up with a jerk. The embroidered calotte fell, and in the twinkling of an eye he had rumpled his hair, all ends up, in a most extravagant manner. In this state he strove to speak. With every effort his eyes seemed to start further out of their sockets. His head looked like a mop. He choked, gasped, swallowed, and managed to shriek out the one word, "Beast!" From that moment till Falk went out of the cabin, the girl, with her hands folded on the work lying in her lap, never took her eyes off him. His own, in the blindness of his heart, darted all over the cabin, only seeking to avoid the sight of Hermann's raving. It was ridiculous, and was made almost terrible by the stillness of every other person present. It was contemptible, and was made appalling by the man's overmastering horror of this awful sincerity coming to him suddenly with the confession of such a fact. He walked with great strides. He gasped. He wanted to know from Falk how dared he come and tell him this. Did he think himself a proper person to be sitting in this cabin where his wife and children lived? Tell his niece? Expected him to tell his niece? His own brother's daughter? Shameless! Did I ever hear tell of such impudence? He appealed to me. This man here ought to have gone and hidden himself out of sight instead of... But it was a great misfortune for me. But it was a great misfortune for me, Falk would ejaculate from time to time. However, Hermann kept on running frequently against the corners of the table. At last he lost a slipper, and, crossing his arms on his breast, walked up with one stocking foot very close to Falk, in order to ask him whether he did think there was anywhere on earth a woman abandoned enough to mate with such a monster. Did he? Did he? Did he? I tried to restrain him. He tore himself out of my hands. He found his slipper, and endeavoring to put it on, stormed standing on one leg, and Falk, with a face unmoved and averted eyes, grasped all his mighty beard in one vast palm. Was it right, then, for me to die myself? He asked thoughtfully. I laid my hand on his shoulder. Go away, I whispered imperiously, without any clear reason for this advice. except that I wished to put an end to Hermann's odious noise. Go away. He looked searchingly for a moment at Hermann before he made a move. I left the cabin, too, to see him out of the ship, but he hung about the quarter-deck. "It is my misfortune," he said in a steady voice. "You are stupid to blurt it out in such a manner. After all, we don't hear such confidences every day." "What does the man mean?" he mused in deep undertones. "Somebody had to die, but why me?" He remained still for a time in the dark, silent, almost invisible. All at once he pinned my elbows to my sides. I felt utterly powerless in his grip, and his voice, whispering in my ear, vibrated. "It's worse than hunger, Captain. Do you know what that means? And I could kill then, or be killed. I wish the crowbar had smashed my skull 10 years ago, and I've got to live now, without her. Do you understand? Perhaps many years. But how? What can be done? If I had allowed myself to look at her once, I would have carried her off before that man in my hands like this." I felt myself snatched off the deck, then suddenly dropped, and I staggered backwards, feeling bewildered and bruised. What a man! All was still. He was gone. I heard Hermann's voice declaiming in the cabin and went in. I could not at first make out a single word, but Mrs. Hermann, who, attracted by the noise, had come in some time before, with an expression of surprise and mild disapproval depicted broadly on her face, was now giving all the signs of profound, helpless agitation. Her husband shot a string of guttural words at her, and instantly putting out one hand to the bulkhead as if to save herself from falling, she clutched the loose bosom of her dress with the other. He harangued the two women extraordinarily, with much of his shirt hanging out of his waist-belt, stamping his foot, turning from one to the other, sometimes flinging both his arms straight up above his rumpled hair, and keeping them in that position while he uttered a passage of loud denunciation. At others, folding them tight across his breast, and then he hissed with indignation, elevating his shoulders and protruding his head. The gal was crying. She had not changed her attitude. From her steady eyes that, following Falk in his retreat, had remained fixed wistfully on the cabin door, the tears fell rapid, thick on her hands, on the work in her lap, warm and gentle like a shower in spring. She wept without grimacing, without noise, very touching, very quiet, with something more of pity than of pain in her face, as one weeps in compassion rather than grief. And Hermann, before her, declaimed. I caught several times the words Mensch, man, and also fressen, which last I looked up afterwards in my dictionary. It means devour. Hermann seemed to be requesting an answer of some sort from her. His whole body swayed. She remained mute and perfectly still. At last his agitation gained her. She put the palms of her hands together, her full lips parted. No sound came. His voice scolded shrilly. His arms went like a windmill. Suddenly he shook his thick fist at her. She burst out into loud sobs. He seemed stupefied. Mrs. Hermann rushed forward, babbling rapidly. The two women fell on each other's necks, and, with an arm round her niece's waist, she led her away. Her own eyes were simply streaming. Her face was flooded. She shook her head back at me negatively. I wonder why to this day. The girl's head dropped heavily on her shoulder. They disappeared together. Then Hermann sat down and stared at the cabin floor. "We don't know all the circumstances," I ventured to break the silence. He retorted tartly that he didn't want to know of any. According to his ideas, no circumstances could excuse a crime, and certainly not such a crime. This was the opinion generally received. The duty of a human being was to starve. Falk, therefore, was a beast, an animal, base, low, vile, despicable, shameless, and deceitful. He had been deceiving him since last year. He was, however, inclined to think that Falk must have gone mad quite recently, for no sane person, without necessity, uselessly, for no earthly reason, and regardless of another's self-respect and peace of mind, would own to having devoured human flesh. "Why, tell," he cried, "who was asking him?" It showed Falk's brutality, because after all he had selfishly caused him, Hermann, much pain. He would have preferred not to know that such an unclean creature had been in the habit of caressing his children. He hoped I would say nothing of all this ashore, though. He wouldn't like it to get about that he had been intimate with an eater of men, a common cannibal. As to the scene he had made, which I judged quite unnecessary, he was not going to inconvenience and restrain himself for a fellow that went about courting and upsetting girls' heads, while he knew all the time that no decent housewifely girl would think of marrying him. At least he, Hermann, could not conceive how any girl could. Fancy Lena! No, it was impossible. The thoughts that would come into their heads every time they sat down to a meal. Horrible! Horrible! "You are too squeamish, Hermann," I said. He seemed to think it was eminently proper to be squeamish if the word meant disgust at Falk's conduct, and turning up his eyes sentimentally, he drew my attention to the horrible fate of the victims of that Falk. I said that I knew nothing about them. He seemed surprised. Could not anybody imagine without knowing? He, for instance, felt he would like to avenge them. "But what if," said I, "there had not been any? They might have died, as it were, naturally, of starvation." He shuddered. "But to be eaten after death, to be devoured!" He gave another deep shudder and asked suddenly, "Do you think it is true?" His indignation and his personality together would have been enough to spoil the reality of the most authentic thing. When I looked at him, I doubted the story. But the remembrance of Falk's words, looks, gestures, invested it not only with an air of reality, but the absolute truth of primitive passion. It is true just as much as you are able to make it, and exactly in the way you like to make it. For my part, when I hear you clamoring about it, I don't believe it is true at all." And I left him pondering. The men in my gig, lying at the foot of Diana's side ladder, told me that the captain of the tug had gone away in his boat some time ago. I let my fellows pull an easy stroke. Because of the heavy dew, the clear sparkle of the stars seemed to fall on me cold and wetting. There was a sense of lurking, gruesome horror somewhere in my mind, and it was mingled with clear and grotesque images. Schomberg's gastronomic tittle-tattle was responsible for these, and I half hoped I should never see Falk again. But the first thing my anchor watchman told me was that the captain of the tug was on board. He had sent his boat away, and was now waiting for me in the cuddy. He was lying full length on the stern settee, his face buried in the cushions. I had expected to see it discomposed, contorted, despairing. It was nothing of the kind. It was just as I had seen it 20 times, steady and glaring from the bridge of the tug. It was immovably set and hungry, dominated like the whole man by the singleness of one instinct. He wanted to live. He had always wanted to live. So do we all. But in us the instinct serves a complex conception, and in him this instinct existed alone. There is in such simple development a gigantic force, and like the pathos of a child's naive and uncontrolled desire. He wanted that girl, and the utmost that can be said for him was that he wanted that particular girl alone. I think I saw then the obscure beginning, the seed germinating in the soil of an unconscious need, the first shoot of that tree bearing now for a mature mankind the flower and the fruit, the infinite gradation in shades and in flavor of our discriminating love. He was a child. He was as frank as a child, too. He was hungry for the girl, terribly hungry, as he had been terribly hungry for food. Don't be shocked if I declare that in my belief it was the same need, the same pain, the same torture. We are, in his case, allowed to contemplate the foundation of all the emotions, that one joy which is to live, and the one sadness at the root of the innumerable torments. It was made plain by the way he talked. He had never suffered so. It was gnawing, it was fire. It was there, like this. And after pointing below his breastbone, he made a hard, ringing motion with his hands. And I assure you that, seen as I saw it with my bodily eyes, it was anything but laughable. And again, as he was presently to tell me, alluding to an early incident of the disastrous voyage when some damaged meat had been flung overboard, he said that a time soon came when his heart ached. That was the expression he used, and he was ready to tear his hair out at the thought of all that rotten beef thrown away. I heard all this. I witnessed his physical struggles, seeing the working of the rack and hearing the true voice of pain. I witnessed it all patiently, because the moment I came into the cuddy, he had called upon me to stand by him. And this, it seems, I had diplomatically promised. His agitation was impressive and alarming in the little cabin, like the floundering of a great whale driven into a shallow cove in a coast. He stood up. He flung himself down headlong. He tried to tear the cushion with his teeth. And again, hugging it fiercely to his face, he let himself fall on the couch. The whole ship seemed to feel the shock of his despair, and I contemplated with wonder the lofty forehead, the noble touch of time on the uncovered temples, the unchanged hungry character of the face, so strangely ascetic and so incapable of portraying emotion. What should he do? He had lived by being near her. He had sat in the evening, I knew, all his life. She sewed. Her head was bent, so. Her head like this, and her arms, had I seen, like this. He dropped on a stool, bowed his powerful neck, whose nape was red, and with his hands stitched the air, ludicrous, sublimely imbecile and comprehensible. And now he couldn't have her? No, that was too much. After thinking, too, that what had he done? What was my advice? Take her by force? No? Mustn't he? Who was there to stop him? For the first time I saw one of his features move, a fighting, teeth-bearing curl of the lip. Not Hermann, perhaps. He lost himself in thought as though he had fallen out of the world. I may note that the idea of suicide apparently did not enter his head for a single moment. It occurred to me to ask, "Where was it that this shipwreck of yours took place?" "Down south," he said vaguely with a start. "You are not down south now," I said. "Violence won't do. They would take her away from you in no time." "And what was the name of the ship?" "Borgmester Dahl," he said. "It was no shipwreck." He seemed to be waking up by degrees from that trance, and waking up calmed. Not a shipwreck? What was it? Breakdown, he answered, looking more like himself every moment. By this only I learned that it was a steamer. I had till then supposed they had been starving in boats, or on a raft, or perhaps on a barren rock. She did not sink, then? I asked in surprise. He nodded. We sighted the southern ice, he pronounced dreamily. And you alone survived? He sat down. Yes, it was a terrible misfortune for me. Everything went wrong. All the men went wrong. I survived. Remembering the things one reads of, it was difficult to realize the true meaning of his answers. I ought to have seen at once, but I did not. So difficult is it for our minds, remembering so much, instructed so much, informed of so much, to get in touch with the real actuality at our elbow. And with my head full of preconceived notions as to how a case of cannibalism and suffering at sea should be managed, I said, You were then so lucky in the drawing of lots? Drawing of lots, he said. What lots? Do you think I would have allowed my life to go for the drawing of lots? Not if he could help it, I perceived, no matter what other life went. It was a great misfortune. Terrible. Awful, he said. Many heads went wrong, but the best men would live. The toughest, you mean, I said. He considered the word. Perhaps it was strange to him, though his English was so good. Yes, he asserted at last. The best. It was everybody for himself at last, and the ship open to all. Thus, from question to question, I got the whole story. I fancy it was the only way I could that night have stood by him. Outwardly, at least, he was himself again. The first sign of it was the return of that incongruous trick he had of drawing both his hands down his face. And it had its meaning now, with that slight shudder of the frame and the passionate anguish of these hands uncovering a hungry, immovable face, the wide pupils of the intent, silent, fascinating eyes. It was an iron steamer of a most respectable origin. The burgomaster of Falk's native town had built her. She was the first steamer ever launched there. The burgomaster's daughter had christened her. Country people drove in carts from miles around to see her. He told me all this. He got the berth as what we would call chief mate. He seemed to think it had been a feather in his cap, and in his own corner of the world this lover of life was of good parentage. The burgomaster had advanced ideas in the ship-owning line. At that time, not everyone would have known enough to think of dispatching a cargo steamer to the Pacific, but he loaded her with pitch-pine deals and sent her off to hunt for her luck. Wellington was to be the first port, I fancy. It doesn't matter, because in latitude 44 degrees south and somewhere halfway between Good Hope and New Zealand, the tail shaft broke and the propeller dropped off. They were steaming then with a fresh gale on the quarter and all their canvas set to help the engines. But by itself the sail power was not enough to keep way on her. When the propeller went, the ship broached to at once, and the masts got whipped overboard. The disadvantage of being dismasted consisted in this, that they had nothing to hoist flags on to make themselves visible at a distance. In the course of the first few days, several ships failed to sight them, and the gale was drifting them out of the usual track. The voyage had been from the first neither very successful nor very harmonious. There had been quarrels on board. The captain was a clever, melancholic man who had no unusual grip on his crew. The ship had been amply provisioned for the passage, but Somehow or other, several barrels of meat were found spoiled on opening, and had been thrown overboard soon after leaving home as a sanitary measure. Afterwards, the crew of the Borgmesterdal thought of that rotten carrion with tears of regret, covetousness, and despair. She drove south. To begin with, there had been an appearance of organization, but soon the bonds of discipline became relaxed. A somber idleness succeeded. They looked with sullen eyes at the horizon. The gales increased. She lay in the trough, and the seas made a clean breach over her. One frightful night, when they expected their hulk to turn over with them every moment, a heavy sea broke on board, deluged the storerooms, and spoiled the best part of the remaining provisions. It seems the hatch had not been properly secured. This instance of neglect is characteristic of utter discouragement. Falk tried to inspire some energy into his captain, but failed. From that time he retired more into himself, always trying to do his utmost in the situation. It grew worse. Gale succeeded gale, with black mountains of water hurling themselves on the Borgmesterdal. Some of the men never left their bunks. Many became quarrelsome. The chief engineer, an old man, refused to speak at all to anybody. Others shut themselves up in their berths to cry. On calm days, the inert steamer rolled on a leaden sea under a murky sky, or showed in sunshine the squalor of sea waifs, the dried white salt, the rust, the jagged broken places. Then the gales came again. They kept body and soul together on short rations. Once an English ship, scudding in a storm, tried to stand by them, heaving to pluckily under their lee. The seas swept her decks. The men in oilskins clinging to her rigging looked at them, and they made desperate signs over their shattered bulwarks. Suddenly her main topsail went, yard and all, in a terrific squall. She had to bear up under bare poles, and disappeared. Other ships had spoken them before, but at first they had refused to be taken off, expecting the assistance of some steamer. There were very few steamers in those latitudes then, and when they desired to leave this dead and drifting carcass, no ship came in sight. They had drifted south, out of men's knowledge. They failed to attract the attention of a lonely whaler, and very soon the edge of the polar ice cap rose from the sea and closed the southern horizon like a wall. One morning they were alarmed by finding themselves floating amongst detached pieces of ice. But the fear of sinking passed away like their vigor, like their hopes. The shocks of the floes knocking against the ship's side could not rouse them from their apathy, and the Borgmesterdal drifted out again, unharmed, into open water. They hardly noticed the change. The funnel had gone overboard in one of the heavy rolls. 2 of their 3 boats had disappeared, washed away in bad weather, and the davits swung to and fro, unsecured, with chafed rope's ends waggling to the roll. Nothing was done on board, and Falk told me how he had often listened to the water washing about the dark engine room, where the engines, stilled forever, were decaying slowly into a mass of rust, as the stilled heart decays within the lifeless body. At first, after the loss of the motive power, the tiller had been thoroughly secured by lashings. But in course of time, these had rotted, chafed, rusted, parting one by one, and the rudder, freed, banged heavily to and fro, night and day, sending dull shocks through the whole frame of the vessel. This was dangerous. Nobody cared enough to lift a little finger. He told me that even now, sometimes, waking up at night, he fancied he could hear the dull, vibrating thuds. The pintles carried away, and it dropped off at last. The final catastrophe came with the sending off of their one remaining boat. It was Falk who had managed to preserve her intact, and now it was agreed that some of the hands should sail away into the track of the shipping to procure assistance. She was provisioned with all the food they could spare for the 6 who were to go. They waited for a fine day. It was long in coming. At last, one morning, they lowered her into the water. Directly, in that demoralized crowd, trouble broke out. 2 men who had no business there had jumped into the boat under the pretense of unhooking the tackles, while some sort of squabble arose on the deck amongst these weak, tottering specters of a ship's company. The captain, who had been for days living secluded and unapproachable in the chart-room, came to the rail. He ordered the 2 men to come up on board and threatened them with his revolver. They pretended to obey, but suddenly cutting the boat's painter, gave a shove against the ship's side and made ready to hoist the sail. "Shoot, sir! Shoot them down!" cried Falk, "and I will jump overboard to regain the boat." But the captain, after taking aim with an irresolute arm, turned suddenly away. A howl of rage arose. Falk dashed into his cabin for his own pistol. When he returned, it was too late. 2 more men had leaped into the water, but the fellows in the boat beat them off with the oars, hoisted the boat's lug, and sailed away. They were never heard of again. Consternation and despair possessed the remaining ship's company, till the apathy of utter hopelessness reasserted its sway. That day a fireman committed suicide, running up on deck with his throat cut from ear, to the horror of all hands. He was thrown overboard. The captain had locked himself in the chart-room, and Falk, knocking vainly for admittance, heard him reciting over and over again the names of his wife and children, not as if calling upon them or commending them to God, but in a mechanical voice like an exercise of memory. Next day the doors of the chart-room were swinging open to the roll of the ship, and the captain had disappeared. He must, during the night, have jumped into the sea. Falk locked both the doors and kept the keys. The organized life of the ship had come to an end. The solidarity of the men had gone. They became indifferent to each other. It was Falk who took in hand the distribution of such food as remained. Sometimes whispers of hate were heard passing between the languid skeletons that drifted endlessly to and fro, north and south, east and west, upon that carcass of a ship. And in this lies the grotesque horror of this somber story. The last extremity of sailors overtaking a small boat or a frail craft seems easier to bear because of the direct danger of the seas. The confined space, the close contact, the imminent menace of the waves seems to draw men together in spite of madness, suffering, and despair. But there was a ship, safe, convenient, roomy, a ship with beds, bedding, knives, forks, comfortable cabins, glass and china, and a complete cook's galley, pervaded, ruled, and possessed by the pitiless specter of starvation. The lamp oil had been drunk, the wicks cut up for food, the candles eaten. At night she floated dark in all her recesses and full of fears. One day Falk came upon a man gnawing a splinter of pine wood. Suddenly he threw the piece of wood away, tottered to the rail, and fell over. Falk too late to prevent the act, saw him claw the ship's side desperately before he went down. Next day another man did the same thing, after uttering horrible imprecations. But this one somehow managed to get hold of the broken rudder chains and hung on there silently. Falk set about trying to save him, and all the time the man, holding with both hands, looked at him anxiously with his sunken eyes. Then, just as Falk was ready to put his hand on him, the man let go his hold and sank like a stone. Falk reflected on these sights. His heart revolted against the horror of death, and he said to himself that he would struggle for every precious minute of his life. One afternoon, as the survivors lay about on the after-deck, the carpenter, a tall man with a black beard, spoke of the last sacrifice. There was nothing eatable left on board. Nobody said a word to this, but that company separated quickly. These listless, feeble spectres slunk off one by one to hide in fear of each other. Falk and the carpenter remained on deck together. Falk liked the big carpenter. He had been the best man of the lot, helpful and ready as long as there was anything to do, the longest hopeful, and had preserved to the last some vigor and decision of mind. They did not speak to each other. Henceforth no voices were to be heard conversing sadly on board that ship. After a time the carpenter tottered away forward, but later in the day Falk, going to drink at the freshwater pump, had the inspiration to turn his head. The carpenter had stolen upon him from behind, and summoning all his strength was aiming with a crowbar a blow at the back of his skull. Dodging just in time, Falk made his escape and ran into his cabin. While he was loading his revolver there, he heard the sound of heavy blows struck upon the bridge. The locks of the chart-room doors were slight. They flew open, and the carpenter, possessing himself of the captain's revolver, fired a shot of defiance. Falk was about to go on deck and have it out at once, when he remarked that one of the ports of his cabin commanded the approaches of the fresh-water pump.